Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. We've still got plenty of seats. Hi, everybody. I'm Steph Bertolzi. I'm the Dean of the School of Public Health, and I'm very grateful to all of you for coming. I first want to start by thanking our co-sponsors. I have to start by thanking my colleague, who's actually from one of the co-sponsoring groups. Where is Kate? Is she outside? There she is. She's right here. Kate German from our Maternal and Child Health Group, and the Maternal and Child Health Group also contributed. The UC Berkeley Disability Studies Program, the HIFIS, the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society, including in particular the Disability Studies Cluster, and the Disabled Students Program, TRIO. I also want to mention that, and I'm very grateful to all of them, and even more grateful to our speaker, I'll mention in a minute. I also need to do a quick plug. On April 17th is our next talk, and that's Mike Merson, who's the head of Global Health at Duke University, formerly Dean of the School of Public Health at Yale, and before that, head of the Global AIDS Program at WHO. He's going to be here to talk about the United States and the future of global health. The talk doesn't say in the age of Trump, but I know that's what he's going to talk about. And an apology, not that you're ever supposed to start with an apology, but this seems to be the one room on campus that doesn't have an internet connection. So what that means is that for those of you who are watching on live stream, the live stream is going to be a very new-fashioned, old-fashioned way, as in it's running off of Matthew's cell phone. And so it may be a bit jerky. It won't have quite the bandwidth that you're used to, and I apologize for that. So the reason we're here tonight is thanks to Eli Clare, who's here with us, and he's come a long ways. He's come from Vermont, even though he went to school at Mills down the street. And he's a writer and activist. He speaks all over the US and Canada about disability, queer and trans identities, and social justice. We're very grateful he agreed to come and speak with us here. This time he came across by train. It's a long trip, but having done most of it, it's a beautiful trip. But in the past, he's walked all the way across. He didn't do that for us today. But he went from LA to DC, walked for peace. He helped organize the first U.S. Queerness and Disability Conference, and he's the author of multiple books, including a book of essays called Exile and Pride, Disability, Queerness, and Liberation, a book of poetry, The Marrow's Telling, Words in Motion, and his newest book, which, if all goes well, we'll have available afterwards. I haven't seen the boxes, but I'm hoping they're outside. And it's Brilliant Imperfection, Grappling with Cure, which combines memoir, storytelling, history, and political thinking to dive into the multiple meanings and realities of cure. Kate, Eli, thank you so much.
Technology. Thank you all for being here. And thank you for everyone who made this visit possible. It's really lovely to be here with this brand new book, which took me 13 years to write, and I will attempt not to move this microphone because it's odd. So before I get started, I want to do a couple pieces of access. For those of you who can hear, how's my volume in back? If that changes, let me know. Shout, wave a hand, but just let me know, but don't throw rotten tomatoes, you know, they make kind of a mess. Another piece of access for the photographers in the room, if we could not use flash while we're in public space, that would be really good. If you need to take some pictures of me with flash, let's do that later in not public space. Let's see what else. Let's smash this room up in whatever ways we need to be here. If you need to find a wall to lean on, go find a wall. If you need some floor to lie down on, there's some floor up here. If you need to leave and not come back, please leave. If you need to leave and come back, do that. If you need to knit, to listen, knit. If you need to stim, flap your hands, rock, do that. Let's mash the space up in whatever ways possible. And I want to acknowledge that we're on Indigenous land today, on Wapo and Ohlone land. And also acknowledge that we're doing this in a very particular political movement that have many of us doing active resistance every day, whatever that resistance looks like. And it's my hope that tonight and these ideas and this book can somehow be part of that resistance. So I'm going to be reading for about 45 minutes from the book, specifically reading about an arc from diagnosis to cure. And when I say cure, I mean C-U-R-E. And I say that because sometimes I say cure and people hear care, and then nothing I say makes sense at all. So cure. So reading about this arc from diagnosis through cure, back to diagnosis, and then after I read, I hope that we can have a community conversation, and after that, there's some food to be eaten, I think. So that's what the next hour and a half or hour and 45 minutes looks like. So I'm going to start with diagnosis, and in the book there are 3 pieces about diagnosis, kind of laying out this idea that we can have many different connections to diagnosis, and that the same diagnosis can mean different things for different people. It's not that there are bad diagnoses and good diagnoses, it's just that there are multiple relationships to any one diagnosis. And so I'm going to begin this reading and end this reading with 2 of those diagnosis pieces. The first one is called cerebral palsy. I remember being 12 years old, my parents bringing me to the Crippled Children's Division, otherwise known as CCD, at the University of Oregon for yet another round of diagnostic testing. I remember walking back and forth for an orthopedist, stacking blocks for a physical therapist, and solving puzzles for a team of psychologists. I knew this diagnostic routine all too well. I can't remember how many I can't count how many IQ tests I took, how many soundproof rooms I sat in as audiologists checked my hearing, how many words I repeated one after another as speech pathologists analyzed which sounds my tongue stumbled over. All the orthopedists, physical therapists, psychologists, audiologists, speech pathologists blurred together. I can't remember a single face, but the one-way mirrors, those glass walls behind which they watched my every move, remain vivid. At CCD, after 2 days of testing, the physical therapist sat us down and told my parents that I had cerebral palsy. Years later, I learned she was the first medical provider to give me that diagnosis. It crushed my parents, who had brought me there specifically to find a cure. Instead, we returned home with the diagnosis for an incurable condition, my first orthopedic equipment since the big blocky shoe that helped me learn to walk. I ride the slow loops of memory, each faint arc shimmering back and back to where diagnosed started. A physical therapist said the words cerebral palsy, and the orthopedist suggests heel cord surgery. Reflections in the shiny one-way mirror stare at me. A speech therapist reaches into my mouth to hold, encourage, shape the muscle of my tongue. Memory glimmers, another earlier physical therapy office, and here, my first flash. White coats, voices, a table, fear of falling. I look up. And before I read further, I want a heads up. This next section is intensely about institutionalization and medicalization. I look up. It's 1966. And I am 2.5 years old, no longer stumping around on my knees, but balancing on my own 2 feet, taking my first shaky steps, a loop of its own with no trace of memory. I'm not talking yet, not a single spoken word. I use a rudimentary sign language of my own creation. It's 1966, and my parents have brought me to this institution, which at its founding in 1908 was known as the State Institution for the Feeble-Minded. 30 years later, was renamed the Oregon Fairview Home, and by the time I show up, is called the Fairview Hospital and Training Center. Historians Philip Ferguson, Diane Ferguson, and Meredith Brodsky write, quote, Fairview Training Center was not the first such institution to open, or the last to close. Even at its peak population, it was not the biggest. Of those who lived there know only too well, it definitely was not the best. But as others who lived elsewhere can also testify, it was certainly not the worst. If there can be such a thing, the Fairview Training Center could be called a typical institution for people with developmental disabilities, end quote. It's 1966, and the doctors give me an IQ test. 50 years earlier, American eugenicist Henry Goddard sought a way to quantify intelligence, eager to have a tool that would reveal the feeble-mindedness he and many others believed was overtaking the United States. It's a moment that sounds awfully familiar. To this end, he translated, revised, and championed a French intelligence test. He coined the word moron. He put his work through trial runs at Ellis Island using Jewish, Hungarian, Russian, and Italian immigrants as his subjects. He found 40% of the people he tested to be morons, which, of course, was the point, to prove what eugenicists already believed about immigrants and feeble-mindedness. Goddard's work became the test I take It's 1966, and Fairview houses nearly 3,000 people. In 1920, and here I'm going to be using the language of the time. In 1920, we were called idiot, imbecile, and moron. In 1950, retarded and handicapped. And now we are beginning to be called developmentally disabled, not yet known as intellectually disabled. The diagnostic language slips and slides over the decades. Of the 3,000 people who live here, many have been locked away for their entire lives. It's 1966, and I scored badly on their tests. Not many years before, they would have declared me a low-grade moron or a high-grade imbecile. But by the 1960s, the words have changed, even as the laws and institutions have not. I've become mentally retarded. It's 1966, and the Oregon doctors still sterilize people on a monthly basis. They use the state's eugenics legislation, first passed in 1917, to authorize involuntary castrations, vasectomies, hysterectomies, and tubal ligations. Before the law was repealed in 1983, they perform at least 2,648 of these surgeries. It's 1966, and I joined the ranks of those targeted. The Oregon law names us, quote, and this is a direct quote from the legislation, the Oregon law names us, quote, feeble-minded, insane, epileptics, habitual criminals, moral degenerates, and sexual perverts, who are persons potential to producing offspring who, because of inheritance of inferior or antisocial traits, would probably become a social menace, end quote. Sterilization is often the sole criteria for release from Fairview. If my parents did nothing else, they didn't leave me there. They definitely could have. With some frequency, people ask, what's wrong with you? What happened to you? What's your defect? Or they play a guessing game. Is it multiple sclerosis or Parkinson's, muscular dystrophy, or ALS? Usually I answer quickly, cerebral palsy? No, it's not progressive, and no, it's not terminal. Curiosity satiated, they move on. I could respond with any number of diagnoses. I could deflect, you choose. In 1966, a doctor said mental retardation, and in 1976, a physical therapist said cerebral palsy. I could push. What more do you know about me now that you have two diagnoses to attach to my body-mind? It's much easier just to say cerebral palsy and move on. So as I grappled with cure, I also knew I had to grapple with diagnosis, whether I wanted to or not. So this next piece begins that grappling. It's called reading diagnosis. It's impossible to grapple with cure without encountering white Western medical diagnosis. Ink on paper in the diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders and the International Classification of Diseases, a process in the hands of doctors, a system of categorization. I want to read diagnosis as a source of knowledge, sometimes trustworthy and other times suspect, as a tool and a weapon shaped by particular belief systems, useful and dangerous by turns, as a furious storm exerting pressure in many directions. Simply put, diagnosis wields immense power. It can provide us access to vital medical technology or shame us. Reveal a path toward less pain or get us locked up. It opens doors and slams them shut. Diagnosis names the conditions in our body-minds, charts the connections between them. It holds knowledge, it organizes visceral realities, it draws borders and boundaries, separating fluid in the lungs from high blood pressure, ulcers from kidney stones, declaring anxiety attacks distinct from heart attacks, post-traumatic stress disconnected from depression. It legitimizes some pain as real. It identifies other pain as psychosomatic or malingering. It reveals little about the power of these borders and boundaries. Through its technology, X-rays, MRIs, blood draws, EKGs, CAT scans, diagnosis transforms our three-dimensional body-minds into two-dimensional graphs and charts, images on whiteboards, symptoms in databases, words on paper. It holds history and creates baselines. It predicts the future and shapes all sorts of decisions. It unleashes political and cultural forces. At its best, diagnosis affirms our distress, orients us to what's happening in our body, minds, helps make meaning out of chaotic, visceral experiences. But diagnosis rarely stays at its best. It can also disorient us or devalue what we know about ourselves. It can leave us with doubts, questions, shame. It can catapult us out of our body minds. All too often, diagnosis is poorly conceived or flagrantly oppressive. It is brandished as authority. Our body minds bend to match diagnostic criteria rather than vice versa. Diagnosis can become a cover for what healthcare providers don't understand, become more important than our messy, visceral selves, become the totality of who we are. These experiences of disorientation and devaluing are often called misdiagnosis, as if the ambiguity and the ambivalence contained within diagnosis could be resolved by determining its accuracy. But let me redirect this focus on correctness. In my reading of diagnosis, I'm not interested in whether I really have cerebral palsy, or whether schizophrenia accurately characterizes the many realities of seeing visions and hearing voices. Rather, I'm inviting us to think about what diagnosis does, because this system not only describes those of us deemed defective, deficient, or disordered in a million different ways, but also helps shape how the world treats us. Consider the diagnosis of mental retardation. Certainly it can name people who think, process, and communicate differently. But with that naming comes a whole host of expectations, stereotypes, and material realities. Mental retardation shapes where and how some people receive education. It influences the unlikelihood that they'll have paid work and homes of their own choosing. It increases the probability of having their children taken away, of landing in prison, a group home, an institution. It can also create access to services and adaptive technologies, individualized education plans, and job training. The diagnosis of mental retardation is often dangerous, sometimes useful, but never neutral, never merely descriptive. Hundreds of forces swirl through diagnoses, each with its own balance of utility and risk. Some carry almost no stigma, others come freighted with discrimination and self-loathing. Still others bring both relief and sorrow. I want to read diagnosis in all its incarnations. So now I want to move a little, and in that moving, acknowledge that diagnosis exists within a whole network of medical processes. Treatment, rehabilitation, management, prevention, and cure. Both diagnosis and cure live in relationship to all of those processes. And if this was a half-day event, we would spend some time talking about what that far-reaching network looks like. But we're not in a half-day event, so we're going to just acknowledge that whole network. And that network only functions because culturally, scientifically, medically, we identify some body minds as being trouble. Quotation, trouble. But for now, I'm going to use the word trouble. And think some about how body minds become known as troubled. So this is called troubled and troubling body minds. And by the way, I'm using the phrase body minds throughout the book to resist the white Western impulse to separate body from mind and bodies here and minds here as if they're not entangled in a million different ways. So I'm using the phrase body minds to acknowledge that entanglement. So troubled and troubling body minds. The trouble that the network of diagnosis, treatment, management, rehabilitation, prevention, and cure revolves around is multidimensional. Within the white Western worldview, many body minds contain trouble, or they are defined entirely by trouble. And this microphone is causing trouble. Or they are defined entirely by trouble, or they cause trouble, or they are deemed both troubled and troubling. These notions raise the question, which realities are defined as trouble by whom and for whose benefit? The answers extend far beyond exam rooms and research labs, public health policy, and diagnostic codes. This query requires us to think about power and privilege, corporate greed, and medical understanding. It touches on the intimate relationships we have with our own body-mind. It engages with realities played out in schools, prisons, and emergency rooms. The answers can be straightforward and widely agreed upon. Culturally, scientifically, and materially, in the dominant system of medicine in the United States, certain body-mind conditions have easily been defined as trouble. A common cold as inconvenient, bronchitis as more urgent, and pneumonia as plainly dangerous. Almost no one will disagree with these assessments. Defining body-mind trouble is seemingly simple and intuitive. But this simplicity is a facade. The medical-industrial complex declares muscular dystrophy to be nothing but trouble, apparently as clear-cut as pneumonia. Yet, this pronouncement is simple only if we disregard voices from inside disability communities. Listen to Harriet McBride Johnson, born with a neuromuscular condition similar to muscular dystrophy. She writes, quote, "At age 15, I threw away the back brace and let my spine reshape itself into a deep, twisty S-curve. Now, my right side is two deep canyons. Since my backbone found its natural shape, I've been entirely comfortable in my skin." End quote. If she and many other disabled people who claim comfort, pleasure, and value in our lives were hated, it would be much more difficult, maybe impossible, to cast muscular dystrophy as unmedicated trouble to eradicate. I'm going to pause for a moment. Do I need to repeat that last paragraph? Okay. Let me start with Harriet McBride Johnson. Listen to Harriet McBride Johnson, born with a neuromuscular condition similar to muscular dystrophy. She writes, quote, "At age 15, I threw away the back brace and let my spine reshape itself into a deep, twisty S-curve. Now, my right side is two deep canyons. Since my backbone found its own natural shape, I've been entirely comfortable in my skin." End quote. If she and the many other disabled people who claim comfort, pleasure, and value in their lives were hated, it would be much more difficult, maybe impossible, to cast muscular dystrophy as unmitigated trouble to eradicate. Too often, the medical-industrial complex names their visceral experiences trouble, regardless of what we know about our own body-minds. But sometimes this dynamic shifts. I think of chronic Lyme disease, chronic fatigue immune dysfunction syndrome, or CFIDS, multiple chemical sensitivities, and Gulf War syndrome. The people who live with these conditions struggle to be taken seriously. They keep saying, "Pay attention, I'm living with significant body-mind trouble. I need help." June Stein writes about the struggle, quote, "Basically every day I had to defend my credibility. The lack of legitimacy surrounding CFIDs came from a media who defined my hellish reality as merely yuppie flu, and the government that flat out denied its existence. Over and over again for 9 years, I've been trying to convince others that though my cheeks are pink and rosy, I am horribly sick," end quote. Inside this climate of disbelief, people with conditions deemed not real are told by Veterans Affairs, their family doctors, specialists, emergency rooms, that all their symptoms are imaginary. Doctors offer people with chronic Lyme and multiple chemical sensitivities antidepressants. Media run reports about people pretending to be sick or disabled. Cultural critics write books naming CFIDs and Gulf War syndrome hysteria. On the one hand, people with muscular dystrophy resist the notion of body-mind trouble as it is repeatedly foisted on them. And on the other hand, people with CFIDs work overtime to have their body-mind trouble acknowledged, while doctors and the media ignore and trivialize it. These two dynamics appear to be opposites, but actually they converge, pivoting on the way the medical industrial complex wields authority and dismisses what we know about our own visceral experiences. Indeed, who defines which realities as body-mind trouble? Sometimes the answers are multiple and conflicting. I think of the contentious issue of height, especially boyhood shortness, as being too short body-mind trouble, particularly in the absence of health issues, however they might be defined, and material conditions such as malnutrition. The answers are conflicting. Eli Lilly, makers of synthetic human growth hormone, or HGH, had one answer. Some doctors and parents agree with the pharmaceutical company, others don't. Short-statured people, both children and adults, have a mix of answers. The organization Little People of America has yet another response. At best, the determinations of body-mind trouble are fraught. So much hangs on these definitions, including millions of dollars of profit. Over the last 60 years, the pharmaceutical corporations that sell HGH have framed shortness as grave trouble that must be addressed as early as possible in a child's, particularly a boy's, life. They've actively worked to expand the market for their drugs, shifting the criteria used to determine who is unacceptably short. In 2003, Eli Lilly petitioned the U.S. Food and Drug Administration and won approval to sell HGH for use not only by children who are short because of a diagnosable disorder, and disorder in big air quotes, but also by those in the bottom 1.2% of height for their age group. So think about that. That means there will always, always, always be children eligible under FDA approved guidelines, eligible for synthetic human growth hormone. Devious. Devious is what I say. This exchange added 400,000 potential customers to Eli Lilly's market. 3 years after this decision, the HGH drug, Humatrope, made $460 million, up 40% from 2002. All of this means that redefining the body-mind trouble shortness increased Eli Lilly's earnings by $130 million. Sometimes the response to the question which realities are defined as trouble by whom and for whose benefit is transparent. And other times the answers are considered so intuitively obvious that no one bothers to articulate them. I think of heterosexuality, whiteness, and wealth, particularly when two or more of these conditions exist together. Yes, I'm going there. The high rates of neglect and violence in heterosexual nuclear families could easily be defined as trouble. The multi-generational delusion that white people hold about our superiority could definitely qualify as trouble. The hoarding of resources in upper middle class and upper class homes as reflected by an overabundance of clothing, cars, houses, food, money, and lavish vacations could undoubtedly meet the criteria for trouble. And yet the heterosexual nuclear family disorder, the white entitlement syndrome, and the wealthy greed dysfunction haven't been invented. Nor do I actually want them to be. Disorder, syndrome, and dysfunction have been used against far too many people. Still, heterosexuality, whiteness, and wealth simply aren't defined as trouble. I feel almost silly writing something so obvious, and yet in the world where queer and trans people, people of color, and poor people pay an intense price every day for being deemed troubled and troubling, this obvious state of affairs needs to be called out. And I mean called out, not called in. Called out. Queer and trans youth are kicked out of their families and homes. Immigrants of color are detained and deported in record numbers. Black men are 4 times more likely than white people to be diagnosed with schizophrenia. Poor people are called lazy, shiftless, and demonized for their poverty. The consequences for being deemed troubled and troubling pile up fast. And through it all, heterosexuality, whiteness, and wealth escape undiagnosed. No one locked up or kicked out solely because they're straight or white or rich. Many answers to the question who defines which realities as body-mind trouble are bound up with power and privilege. So now I'm going to turn directly to Keir for a moment and read a piece about the drug eflornithine. And the story, as striking and as possibly surprising to some people, is just one example of 100,000 examples that we could spend the next week talking 24/7 and still not be done naming the examples. But the story I'm going to tell is about this drug eflornithine, which I will describe in a moment. The piece is called A Pharmaceutical History of Eflornithine. Cure serves many purposes: saving lives, manipulating lives, prioritizing some lives over others, making profit. Consider, for instance, the pharmaceutical history of eflornithine. This drug successfully cures the late stages of African trypanosomiasis. I'm not sure how that word is actually pronounced, but commonly known as sleeping sickness, a Central African fly-borne disease characterized by pain, neurological symptoms, and sleep disturbances. If left untreated, the illness always leads to death. It kills thousands of people per year. In 1990, the drug company Marion Merrill Dow received approval from the U.S. Food and Drug Administration for eflornithine under the trade name Ornidil. At that point, the only alternative was a harsh, arsenic-based drug that sometimes itself caused death. In contrast, eflornithine revived people in the last stage of sleeping sickness, some of them already in a coma. It became known as the quote-unquote resurrection drug, a nickname that reflected the medication's importance to people living in sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, this nickname, the resurrection drug, is so clearly linked to Christianity and the history of Christian missionaries white Christian missionaries, particularly in Africa. In the early 1990s, through a corporate takeover, Aventis, who acquired Ornidil, let me back up. In the early 1990s, through corporate takeover, Aventis acquired Ornidil. Shortly after, in 1995, they reviewed their new acquisition, noting its high manufacturing costs, poverty in Central Africa, and the lack of a market in the wealthy West. Aventis decided there was no profit to be made and stopped producing the drug. This moment highlights how slippery cure can be. On the surface, the drive to eradicate disease and disorder appears to underpin the development and production of eflornithine, but actually cure's life-saving purpose slips into the background, overshadowed by profit-making. Production of eflornithine only resumed in 2001 after it was also found to successfully remove women's facial hair. Not permanently, but for 8 weeks at a time. Bristol Myers Squibb and Gillette rebranded the drug Vamica and started marketing it to women in the United States. The contrast between Ornidil and Vamica is stark. One saved lives, the other temporarily removed women's facial hair. One wasn't produced for 6 years, the other is advertised in glossy, major mainstream women's magazines, leveraging sexist, racist beauty standards and reinforcing the notion that women don't or shouldn't have facial hair. In prioritizing U.S. women, many of them white and middle class, Aventis, Bristol Myers Squibb, and Gillette leave poor, rural, sub-Saharan Africans to die. In this moment, cure's life-saving purpose is trumped by its life-manipulating and life-prioritizing purposes, both of which seamlessly slide into its profit-making purpose. The life-saving, life-manipulating, life-prioritizing, and profit-making functions of cure interact in many ways. They bolster, oppose, trump, provide cover for one another. They slip and slide across time and space. These interactions are laden with the politics of race, class, gender, sexuality, and disability. They are bound up with imperialism and multinational capitalism. Through it all, we are urged to believe in the promise of technology as significant as the resurrection drug, and to desire technology as cosmetic as Vamica. And I want to end the reading part of this afternoon by returning to diagnosis. If I can find, yeah, there it is. So again, part of the trick of diagnosis is that many of us have different relationships to different diagnoses, and the same diagnosis can mean different things to different people. So, whereas I have one diagnosis, one relationship to the diagnosis of cerebral palsy, and another relationship to the diagnosis of mental retardation, I have a third kind of relationship to the diagnosis of gender identity disorder. And that's what I want to explore here. And to make sense of that, you need to know that I'm a female to male trans person, meaning I was assigned female at birth. I grew up as a tomboy. I came out as a queer woman, lived as a butch for a long time before my genderqueer self was revealed to me. And now I live as a white man in the world, even as I have an internal sense of being genderqueer. So this is gender identity disorder. My relationships to mental retardation, cerebral palsy, and gender identity disorder, or GID, range widely. The first of these diagnoses have fallen by the wayside, even as it stalks me in the form of hate speech. The second found me during my parents' search for a cure, and is convenient shorthand when I request disability access, navigate the medical-industrial complex, or deal with random curiosity. But it had never orchestrated a life-changing reality. Excuse me, but it had never orchestrated a life-changing revelation. But the third I actively sought out. I started my search not because I needed a diagnosis for my genderqueer self, nor because I thought of my desire to reshape my gendered and sex body mind as a disorder. Instead, I wanted chest reconstruction surgery, and in turn, my surgeon wanted a letter of recommendation from a therapist confirming that I had GID and was a good candidate for surgery. In the scheme of providing medical technology for gender transition in 2002, the surgeon was neither conservative nor liberal. According to the 2001 Standards of Care created by the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association, he could have asked for much more or much less. He might have operated without a letter, but he clearly wanted one. Like diagnoses in general, GID can be thought of as a static category that describes a specific body-mind condition and directs a course of treatment, or it can be thought of as a tool embedded in time, space, culture, and science. In 2002, GID lived in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, 4th edition, text revision, and is traceable over the decades. One strand of this history starts with the first edition of the DSM in 1952. The body-mind experiences of trans and gender non-conforming people were placed in the overarching category, quote-unquote, sexual deviations. And I'm going to be using the language of the DSM here, and some of that language for some of us is friggin' hard to hear, but it's worth saying because part of what I'm doing is tracing the evolution or lack of evolution of that language. The body-mind experiences of trans and gender non-conforming people were placed in the overarching category, quote, sexual deviations, end quote, which included homosexuality, transvestism, pedophilia, fetishism, and sexual sadism. From there, the diagnosis that became known in 1994 as GID twisted and turned through 4 editions of the DSM. In 1980, as lesbian, gay, and bisexual identities and experiences were being removed from the DSM-3, quote, special deviations, end quote, became, quote, paraphilias, end quote, and transvestism became, quote, transvestic fetishism, end quote. Trans also appeared in 2 other diagnoses, transsexualism, quote unquote, used for adults and adolescents, and, quote, gender identity disorder of childhood, end quote. The 1987 revision of the DSM-3 added, quote, gender identity disorder of adolescence and adulthood non-transsexual type, end quote, to this convoluted heap of diagnoses. The 1994 DSM-4 combined most of these diagnoses into gender identity disorder, with one symptom list for adults and another for youth. Transvestic fetishism remained the same. At this point, my head is spinning, and I suspect many of your heads are spinning too. The criteria for each diagnosis keeps shifting. The lines between categories blur. The words disorder, paraphilia, fetish echo through the maze. Shame, violence, and hatred follow close behind. There's nothing neutral about the DSM. My search for a GID diagnosis started with the DSM-4 TR. In 2002, the most conventional treatment laid out in the standards of care began with 3 months of psychotherapy, which led to hormone replacement therapy, and then to any one of a number of surgeries, including chest reconstruction. After finding a surgeon who didn't require hormones before surgery, I started looking for a therapist who had the same philosophy and didn't require 3 months of therapy, partly because none of this healthcare was covered by insurance. And we may be returning to that reality really soon, depending on what happened with the ACA debacle right now, or not the ACA debacle, but the debacle of repealing the ACA. I found a social worker through word of mouth in the local trans community. She wanted 5 sessions. She posed a lot of questions, a few of them insightful, many of them irrelevant, and several of them directly offensive. I vividly remember the moment when she asked, and I'm not making this question up, you can't make this kind of stuff up, or at least I can't. I vividly remember the moment when she asked, was your father a cross-dresser? Did he have any sexual fetishes or perversions? She didn't inquire about my mother. Evidently, her behavior was inconsequential. I paused. The ironies overwhelmed me. To my knowledge, my father wasn't a cross-dresser, but I certainly was. Wearing his work clothes throughout my teenage years, I adored the faded blue denim jeans and flannel shirts he handed down to me. But he was also a child molester, a pedophile, the language of the DSM. That reality shaped my entire childhood. I would have far preferred a cross-dressing father. These inappropriate questions about my father were made appropriate by the DSM-4. The diagnosis GID lived next to transvestic fetishism, which was placed next to pedophilia. The latter two lumped together as paraphilias, and all 3 listed in the same chapter. Within this scheme, my therapist's questions made clinical sense. In other words, the taxonomic structure of the DSM shaped her understanding of GID, my father, and me. But wait, the maze isn't finished. The DSM-4 has become the DSM-5. And GRD is now gender dysphoria, or GD, focused not on trans people's gender identities per se, but rather on the distress those identities may cause us. I'm struck by how much the DSM has changed over time. These transformations underline how intensely diagnoses are made up. There's nothing inevitable, natural, or inherent about GID or GD. They are fabricated categories that reflect current white Western cultural and scientific beliefs and practices. Academics call this idea social construction, but I believe the blended phrase made up reveals more about the relationship between diagnoses and the body-minds they categorize. Simply put, the DSM is a highly constructed projection placed on top of particular body-mind experiences in order to label organize and make meaning of them from within a specific worldview. Many transactivists pose fundamental challenges to GID and GD. We want to know why these diagnoses live in the DSM. We object to the ways in which the medical-industrial complex defines our genders as disordered. We resist the pathology foisted upon us. And yet, I want us to reach farther, to imagine dismantling the DSM itself, discarding the concepts of disorder and defect, and developing other means of accessing medical technology beyond white Western diagnosis. Yes, I am suggesting a rebellion. Thank you. So that took longer than I had thought. You know, this book is brand new and I don't yet know what reads and what amount of time. So that took a long time, and I know we've all had a really long day. I'm hoping we can stay and have some community conversation, but I'm suspecting that some of us may need to leave now, and that we all would benefit from a minute or two to stretch in whatever way stretching makes sense. So let's pause here just like for 90 seconds so people who need to leave can leave. We can all stretch a bit. So I want us to have about 15 or maybe 20 minutes of conversation before we move outside to food, and there may be books for sale, I don't know. So lots of people like to frame this part of an event as Q&A, question and answer, as if you all have questions and I have answers. And I know that it doesn't work that way. So I prefer to think of this time as a time for community conversation, for rants and raves, for soapboxes, for disagreements, for confusions, for whatever is in your head and hearts. And we have a roving mic, and I know that some of us are loath to speak into microphone, but I'm going to ask us all to do that, because a microphone lets more of us be part of the conversation. It's part of creating more access in the room. So before you speak, wait for the microphone to come to you. So what's in your heads and hearts right now?
Please identify yourself.
Jeff, show of hands, how many have already thought about the difference between a label and a metric? So a yardstick, you can name a number of inches without using the label small, big. And so the DSM is just a bunch of labels, whereas a thermometer is a metric, and nobody has thought that way. One.
Thank you. So let me ask a specific question that I asked myself as I was writing the book. What is your relationship to diagnosis?
reasons I can't actually. My wheelchair's out there, so I'm stuck. My relationship is so complex in my own life, in my own body, in my own experience, and also now as a provider. One of those provider type, hopefully helpful people who make diagnoses, which are theoretically, hopefully, always engaging client experience in and desire and preferably a need for that diagnosis, while we both may hate the diagnoses at times. Struggling through becoming a trans provider and being a gatekeeper slash diagnoser slash treatment engagement facilitator is another aspect of my relationship. That's enough.
Thanks.
Hi, Eli. I always find that diagnosis I really related to what you said about some people needing and wanting the diagnosis or the label in order to move on, because that way that shows that they're not really interested. And in some ways that used to annoy me, but given how intrusive some people's questions and conversations are, sometimes I'm very grateful when people just want the quick answer and then want to move on. But diagnosis, not only is it the least interesting part of having a disability for me, it's one of the least meaningful parts, because the diagnosis is only part of the cultural and interpersonal experience of having a disability and being treated as a person with a disability, regardless of what the specific diagnosis is. And I think that's why, even though it's not used as much in this country, I kind of like the distinction in Europe and the UK between impairment and disability, where impairment is the actual condition with which we are dealing, and the disability is the social, cultural, psychological, and political condition of experiencing the impairment and being treated as though we have the impairment. But I did actually have a question for you, if that's okay. I know you've made a very persuasive case that diagnosis is a convenient fiction and that it's basically bullshit, which I fully endorse. But the question I have, how was it possible that the clinicians in Eugene or Portland or wherever the hell the Fairview institution is or was, how is it possible that they lacked the training or the insight or the capability to assess your cognitive abilities or to allow you to access and demonstrate your cognitive abilities? How is it that they were able to so catastrophically and stupidly misdiagnose? Given, of course, that diagnosis is irrelevant.
So Fairview is in Salem. Fairview closed in 2000. So just a little background about Fairview. And I want to say that part of the reason I tell that story is because it's a shockingly common experience. It's not that these were far-fetched, incompetent providers. This happens every friggin' day. This is not an unusual story. This is exactly the opposite. This is a very, very usual story. The only thing unusual about this story is I escaped. I'm serious. The only thing unusual about the story is I escaped, and if I hadn't escaped, you wouldn't know, because I would not be standing here. It's an escape that shaped the rest of my life, and it's an escape that most folks for whom this happened, there's no escape. So I want to make sure that that story is not seen as unique or a story that is hinged on one particular provider's incompetence. So having said that, what happened in 1965, I have no idea why my parents took me to Fairview for diagnostic testing. Fairview wasn't a place set up to do diagnosis. I wasn't talking. I didn't have a single sound. I just had this rudimentary sign language that no one recognized as a sign language. And so they gave me this IQ test designed for deaf kids that relied entirely on fine motor coordination, putting puzzles and blocks together. I don't actually remember doing any of it, but I've read about this test since then, and it relies on a kind of fine motor coordination that I simply don't have. You know, if I look tremoring and clumsy and awkward to you now, multiply that by 50, and that's what I looked like when I was 2 years old. So I bombed that test as badly as you can bomb a test. And how I escaped, since I talked about escape earlier, and I think it's an important part of the story to highlight what a complete made-up game IQ testing is. I get to 5.5 years old, and I'm living in the backwoods of Oregon, where my father teaches in the public school system, and the public school system is the only place to get public education. And this is in 1969, where they could have closed the doors to the public school and said, no way, no how, we're not teaching her. Remember, I'm a little tomboy girl tripping over myself as I climb trees, and I won't stop. But my father teaches at the high school. He's one of 11 teachers in that high school. He's also the librarian and the vice principal. Right? Made my high school years hell. But they say to my parents, special ed or nothing, because mental retardation is still my diagnosis. But I've started to talk. And again, this is a moment to recognize how verbal communication and intelligence are linked together. If I still wasn't talking at age 5.5, this escape would never have happened. But I was talking, but understandable only to my parents, but I was talking, and my father said, no. And they said, yes, special ed or nothing. And my father said, no, we're testing again. And because he taught in the high school rather than cleaning floors in the high school, because he was white rather than a person of color, they listened to him. Because he was the vice principal, they listened to him, and they gave me another IQ test. And because I was white, because I spoke English, because I lived in a house where books were valued right underneath food, like it was food and books, that was the order of value in the household I grew up in, I did well on that IQ test. But I did well only because I was white English speaking and grew up in a household that valued books and ideas, with parents who wanted me to go to school, who believed in school. And so I did well on the test, and still the school said, no, special ed, we've never done this before, we can't do this. The the linchpin of the first grade teacher lived down the road from us. We bought the eggs from them. She knew me. She liked me. She was a career first grade teacher. And she said, yeah, I can teach her. And so I became the first not just physically, the first disabled kid to ever be mainstreamed in that school district. But this is not an unusual story, only my escape.
It's not...
I have a request that people say your names before you speak.
My name is Dominica. It's not really super easy to follow that, but I did want to sort of offer a question, a rant, I'm not really sure, but when I taught disability studies to my students and we would talk about cure, and I taught Exile and Pride many times, and there's a section where you talk about, people with disabilities not wanting cures and basically wanting rights and laying out the whole social model of disability, and they would often get very upset and they'd say, well, I'm sure that, some people with disabilities want to be cured. And I said, yes, that's changing. The idea of what we consider a disability is evolving, and that's definitely different. But where I struggle with cure is resources, because we put a tremendous amount of resources into finding cures for particular illnesses. And I'm not saying that that's not important or valuable, but when you look at those dollars and those resources and you compare them to the resources that we put into actually making the lives of people with disabilities better, like in-home services, like basic health care, like things people need to access their lives with which they would undoubtedly have a better quality of life, regardless of their impairment and regardless of the existence of cure, as well as thinking about the fact that we are never going to eradicate human difference. Like, no matter how many cures we come up with, there will still be injury, there will still be disability, and there will still be sort of more. There will never be enough cure to address all of the variation that happens in human bodies that causes pain or discomfort or differences in function or whatever. So that's kind of what I offer my students when thinking about, cure versus not cure. And so I wanted to offer that here, and if people have thoughts or comments around that, I'm definitely open to that.
Yes, yes, yes. And the passage in Exile and Pride that I wrote over 20 years ago.
Can you repeat the title of that?
Exile and Pride. So the passage you're talking about where I say many of us want civil rights, not cures, this new book started partly because I was called in again and again and again on how emphatically I wrote that 20 years ago. People were saying, yeah, but not me. Or they would, no, or that would be said privately but not publicly. In private they'd say, not me. But publicly, we wouldn't be having the conversation. And, but I was called out a dozen times on my emphatic and fierce anti-cure politics, but always in private rooms, never in public. And so I started believing that we disability activists, disability rights movement spaces, had one body politics that was public politics, and another body politics that was a private politics. And I wanted to learn about that. And I started this book with a working thesis that we need a body-mind politics that is as complicated and messy as our body-minds are complicated and messy. And without that complicated and messy politics, we will never find liberation. So let's one more, and then let's break for the reception.
Your talk really brought up so many, more questions than answers for me, and thank you so much. It's so complicated. And I guess my question kind of reflects what you said, and also about, your experience with the curiosity in the day-to-day, just less of an intellectual level and more of a day-to-day, how people react to me. And the curiosity, I guess, it's in having those daily interactions without letting my resentment and my just wanting to just live my life and not have to field a bunch of questions, but how can I have those, engage with people who obviously are just curious, but also, sorry, how can I engage in a way that educates, I guess, rather than is defensive or, I don't know, sort of furthers the cause, I guess.
I want to encourage us to know that education is only one of the responses. We're not obligated to educate. Education isn't the only way to interact with those questions. Would people like to end this portion of the event hearing one more piece? It's kind of short, and it's about these questions. Would that be a good thing? So let me figure out where it is. I don't even know where it is in the book. Where are you? There you are.
While I was looking, Kate gave me one job and I screwed it up. And that was to say that after we finish the reception, any students are welcome to join Eli and Kate for dinner. And remind me where it is because I've already forgotten. 444 Eshelman, which is right next door. It's where the Bear Cafe thing is, the small building just north of us. Whichever direction, I guess it's right there.
So this is called Endless Questions. What's your defect? Where are you from? Are you a girl or a boy? Strangers, doctors, would-be lovers ask these questions at bus stops and in exam rooms, on first dates and grocery store aisles. Inside their questions live unchecked curiosity, a barrage of stereotypes, and their need to locate us on diagnostic maps, racial and ethnic maps, gender maps. Every time someone asks me a curious question about my disability, trying to locate my body-mind, and I answer straight up with the words cerebral palsy, I affirm the authority of diagnosis to name and describe our visceral realities. Can I touch your hair? Have you had the surgery? What's wrong with you? On those maps, our lives become mere landmarks. Parent curiosity takes the place of curiosity, respect, connection. Tellingly, the parallel questions don't exist. In the U.S., no one asks, what caused your heterosexuality? How do you know you're a cisgender man? What's wrong with your symmetrical legs that hold you upright and carry you nearly everywhere? Why are you healthy all the time? You look so white and American. Where are you from? Can I touch your long, straight, blonde hair? The endless questions and their exhausting demands only target those of us deemed abnormal and exotic. People who are white, heterosexual, cisgender, men, middle and upper class, Christian, English-speaking, slender, gender-confirming, non-disabled, documented citizens escape these endless questions. According to the logic of privilege, they do not need to be located. Do you have a penis? What happened to you? What's your accent? In those exhausting exchanges, my two-word diagnostic answer communicates almost nothing about my body-mind. I think about people with cerebral palsy, friends, acquaintances, poets, singers, comedians, painters, lawyers, activists, bloggers, policy wonks, teachers. We shake, slur our words, drool, we stumble, trip, fall, we lack fine motor coordination. Some of us have hands that curl tightly, muscles locked into constrictors. Others of us have hands that flop loosely. We are wheelchair-using quads, crutch-wielding gimps, walkies with slight wobbles in our legs. We use assistive communication technology. Our speech flails and spasms, our words emerge in breathy whispers, our voices are fluid and smooth. Really, what do the curious strangers imagine they have learned about me through this single diagnosis? I wish we could turn these endless questions into an angry, righteous, unforgettable poem, a piercing chorus. Maybe then they wouldn't exhaust us. Thank you.